Welcome back, and jumping right into it. I sped the video up quite a bit. That way we can hopefully not have too long of a video to watch. But the first thing that we're showing here is trying to scan a black object. That's a little bit challenging. And I don't have a ton of markers, but I did set a few out. At the very beginning of the video, you'll see a point where it loses tracking. And so I turned off the exclude base option so that it can use some of the surrounding texture on my turntable to help track the object, and it helps quite a bit. Here right now, what I wound up having to do after I started to scan by hand is I needed to really focus on the car, which has some easy to find geometry to help it track and allow me to scan the rest of the item and try and get a good clean scan with low noise using both the turntable and freehand. Here I am just showing my grip a little bit and another side project that I'm working on. Feel free to check out our website at creativecars.com, where we are selling a kit that allows you to take the Creality Otter and scan wireless, or rather wired to your cell phone instead of wired to the computer. So it is quite handy, and you can still scan with the computer. So it kind of does double duty, and it's a lot more comfortable when scanning than just holding it by hand with no kind of grip or anything. Okay, so we just got done editing the mesh after the point cloud optimization and then doing a simplification. That way we could drop the total file size down to something pretty manageable. Now bringing it into Fusion, we have turned it into a solid, and I'm trying to decide how I want to move things back to the origin and have a clean starting point. Usually one of the best ways is to make a new plane selecting 3 points on the surface, and then you can join that to the body and move everything over to the origin, which is what I first try and do here. And that just helps things out for when you're wanting to add features so that it's not just an object kind of floating in midair, but truthfully you don't really need to. I kind of give up on that here in a second, because since I now have a flat surface that's normal, that it's perpendicular to the depth or the height of the object I'm working on, I can really just work from that surface. So what I first do is I kind of set out the base inner diameter with a conformation measuring the physical part, which you can see on the bottom right of the screen. And then I take a spline and I just roughly sketch around most of the exterior of the object. Aside from some of the features that I know are kind of unique and not extruded all the way up. And then I take that profile and I extrude it up much further than necessary, and then delete the base that I started out with on the bottom. Now, you might notice that I made this piece a lot longer than necessary. And truthfully, that's because when I found these parts sitting in a bag, they came with some extra parts that I could not figure out how it all went together. And so I figured there must be a center section that I was missing, and I would just print this out, the largest that the actual chair could fit that I was trying to fix and replace. And I later found out that it was not necessary. Those pieces actually did not belong to this chair. They were just thrown in the bag as extras because they looked similar. But I do later find out that it is useful having it longer than necessary. As you can see on the bottom right, one of the final prints where I have it unnecessarily long, just because that makes installation and refinement a little bit easier. But back to Fusion 360, you can see that I took some of the unique features that aren't able to be extruded across the entire height of the object, and I'm starting to put some of them in, such as the holes and the other features that help to align this as it's being installed. And I was tempted to just keep this kind of a button that's on the front of it as the meshed surface and not actually recreate something. But then, knowing that I usually like going back and refining and tweaking stuff after the fact, I decided to stop being lazy and just recreate it, even if it is a simplified recreation. That way I could modify it in the future, and that wound up being useful a little bit later in the video. So what I'm doing right now is I'm basically cutting a slot, if you will, on the three sides of this so that that piece is flexible. That's where the original piece actually failed, and subsequently in some of my prints with too much force on that area, they also failed in that area. So even though I spent some time recreating this object, here in a little bit you'll see I do end up going through and creating a second version where I delete it entirely. And then I rely on the feature that's on the back side of it that engages with a screw to help hold everything in. And actually that seems to work quite well. Another thing that you'll notice is that I keep toggling back and forth between the scanned mesh and the component that I'm approximating, and just checking to make sure that none of the features are grossly out of the way and that it's matching the general shape of it. Also recognizing that this goes inside of a tube, since this is a bushing or a type of pilot, if you will, that guides the mechanism. I knew what the inside of that tube was, so I knew what the largest this object could be once I printed it out. So just a few moments ago, you can see that I wound up drawing basically that circle of what that tube is, and then extruding it all the way up just to make sure that I'm not going to have any trouble sliding this new bushing in when I go to install it. And with most things, it is good practice to try and put a radius on most of the sharp edges when you can. It just helps to limit stress risers. Again, eventually I did wind up removing this particular feature as to make it really work in the application. I would have had to thicken up the entire structure, and I could have, but like I said, I tried a method where I just deleted it and it seems to function just fine. So you'll see I just went through and radiused some of the corners, and I'm going back and working on a couple of other areas. I also need to put a taper on the bottom of this to help guide it as it's being inserted. And you'll see I'm just putting a little taper there, and it's not exactly the shape that I'm wanting, but I'm able to make it work by creating a new circle, creating a taper that's close enough, and then I can go in and delete the faces that aren't behaving nicely for me, and it winds up working out just fine. These models aren't meant to be perfect, they're just meant to be functional. And you can see there on the button, I'm just putting a bit of a recessed flat on the leading edge of it, which is similar to how the stock part is also. And that just helps for when it engages. It just makes it a little bit easier when you're pushing it in to lock in. Now on the bottom right, you can see an installed photo of this piece that I print out later. And here at the end of the video, I'll include a functioning video of it. Recognizing that this button might be a challenge, here you can see that I made the second model, as I mentioned, where I go through and I delete a lot of the work that I've already gone ahead and done, just to have a part that's not going to have the same failure mode as the piece that I took out. I wasn't quite sure if it would function well enough or not. Fortunately, it did, and that simplified things. I also noticed through one of my test prints that some of the areas, the piece that I'm working on right now, the wall was a little bit thin in two of the areas, and it just didn't have the component as strong as I would have liked it to be. So I just quickly go in and, again, trace the profile, extrude it all the way up, and then I wound up adding a larger radius, basically to thicken up the corners so that it will print with more material and have a little bit more strength to it. And then after that, I have to go back and clean up a couple of the artifacts that were introduced by my approximations. And here we are almost done. Getting rid of the artifacts, checking over everything, seeing if there's anything that I missed. And since it's looking pretty good, then we'll bring it into the slicer and we'll check through as it's actually building it, looking at it build layer by layer to make sure that there's not going to be any issues or unexpected surprises again. And since it looks like it will be fine, I will start a long print. Luckily it doesn't use much material. And then I'll give it a try and see if it works out and meets expectations or not. So here it is installed. And you can see the chair moves forward and backwards just fine now. It doesn't make any funny sounds, and it actually moves, which it didn't do when I first bought it. So that's a nice win, especially because I got a pretty good deal on these chairs because they're very comfortable. But part of the reason why I got a good deal is they were heavily used. Fortunately, with a 3D scanner and a 3D printer, it's not a big challenge to repair these items and make my purchase a really good value. Anyhow, as usual, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them below. Thank you.